Hey everybody, we're on chapter 11. This is the second part. Just a reminder that the first part, we met Mrs. DeBose. She's the meanest old lady that ever lived. Jem and Scout go to the store. Jem gets Scout a baton, and then on their way there, Mrs. DeBose yells some ugly words. Jem takes the baton out of Scout's hand and destroys all the flowers. He has to go apologize, and in the apology, Mrs. DeBose requests that he come read to him. That's where we left off. In your books, we're on the top of page 141. The following Monday afternoon, Jem and I climbed the steep front steps to Mrs. DeBose's house and padded down the open hallway. Jem, armed with Ivanhoe and full of superior knowledge, knocked at the second door on the left. Mrs. DeBose? He called. Jessie opened the wood door and unlatched the screen door. Is that you, Jem Finch? She said. You got your sister with you. I don't know. Let them both in, Jessie, said Mrs. DeBose. Jessie admitted us and went off to the kitchen. An oppressive odor met us when we crossed the threshold, an odor I had met many times in rain-rotted gray houses where there are coal oil lamps, water dippers, and unbleached domestic sheets. It always made me afraid, expectant, and watchful. In the corner of the room was a brass bed, and in the bed was Mrs. DeBose. I wondered if Jem's activities had put her there, and for a moment I felt sorry for her. She was lying under a pile of quilts and looked almost friendly. There was a marble-topped washstand by her bed. On it were a glass with a teaspoon in it, a red ear syringe, a box of absorbent cotton, and a steel alarm clock standing on three tiny legs. So you brought that dirty little sister of yours, did you? Was her greeting. Jem said quietly, My sister ain't dirty and I ain't scared of you, although I noticed his knees were shaking. I expected a tirade, but all she said was, You may commence reading, Jeremy. Jem sat down in the cane-bottomed chair and opened up Ivanhoe. I pulled up another one and sat beside him. Come closer, said Mrs. DeBose. Come to the side of the bed. We moved our chairs forward. This was the nearest I had ever been to her, and the thing I wanted to do most was move my chair back again. She was horrible. Her face was the color of dirty pillowcase, and the corners of her mouth glistened with wet, which inched like a glacier down the deep grooves enclosing her chin. Old age liver spots dotted her cheeks, and her pale eyes had black pinpoint pupils. Her hands were knobby and the cuticles were grown up over her fingernails. Her bottom plate was not in and her upper lip protruded. From time to time she would draw her nether lip to her upper plate and carry her chin with it. This made the wet move faster. I didn't look any more than I had to. Jem reopened Ivanhoe and began reading. I tried to keep up with him, but he read too fast. When Jem came to a word he didn't know, he skipped it, but Mrs. DeBose would catch him and make him spell it out. Jem read for perhaps 20 minutes, during which time I looked at the soot-stained mantelpiece out the window. I looked at the soot-stained mantelpiece, out the window, and anywhere to keep from looking at her. As he read along, I noticed that Mrs. DeBose's corrections grew fewer and farther between. That Jem had left even one that Jem had even left one sentence dangling in midair. She was not listening. I looked toward the bed. Something had happened to her. She lay on her back with her quilts up to her chin. Only her head and shoulders were visible. Her head moved slowly from side to side. From time to time she would open her mouth wide, and I could see her tongue undulate faintly. Cords of saliva would collect on her lips. She would draw them in and then open her mouth again. Her mouth seemed to have a private existence of its own. It worked separate and apart from the rest of her, out and in like a clam hole at low tide. Occasionally it would say "P't," like some viscous substance coming to a broil. I pulled Jem's sleeves. He looked at me and then at the bed. Her head made its regular sweep toward us, and Jem said, Mrs. DeBose, are you all right? She did not hear him. The alarm clock went off and scared us stiff. A minute later, nerves still tingling, Jem and I were on the sidewalk headed for home. We did not run away. Jessie sent us. Before the clock wound down, she was in the room pushing Jem and me out of it. Shoo, she said, y'all go home. Jem hesitated at the door. It's time for her medicine, Jessie said. As the door swung behind us, I saw Jessie walking quickly toward Mrs. DeBose's bed. It was only 3:45 when we got home, so Jem and I drop-kicked the ball in the backyard until it was time to meet Atticus. Atticus had 2 yellow pencils for me and a football magazine for Jem, which I suppose was his silent reward for our first day session with Mrs. DeBose. Jem told him what happened. "Did she frighten you?" asked Atticus. "No, sir," said Jem, "but she's so nasty. She has fits or something. She spits a lot." "She can't help that. When people are sick, they don't look nice sometimes," he said. "She scared me," I said. That's funny. Atticus looked at me over his glasses. "You don't have to go with Jem, you know." The next afternoon at Mrs. DeBose's was the same as the first, and so was the next, until gradually a pattern emerged. Everything would begin normally. That is, Mrs. DeBose would hound Jem for a while on her favorite subjects, her camellias and our father's nigger-loving propensities. She would grow increasingly silent, then go away from us. The alarm clock would ring, Jessie would shoo us out, and the rest of the day was ours. "Atticus," I said one evening, "what exactly is a nigger lover?" Atticus's face was grave. "Has somebody been calling you that?" Okay, pause. Again, we have this powerful question. If a little kid asked me that, I think my eyes would pop out of my head. My initial reaction would be like, what the heck? Atticus is very calm, and he's going to answer this question in a very direct, and honest, and calm manner, like we all should. "No," Atticus's face was grave. "Had somebody been calling you that?" "No, sir. Mrs. DeBose calls you that. She warms up every afternoon calling you that. Francis called me that last Christmas. That's where I first heard it." "Is that the reason you fought him?" asked Atticus. "Yes, sir." "Then why are you asking me what it means?" I tried to explain to Atticus that it wasn't so much what Francis had said that infuriated me as the way he had said it. It was like he said snot nose or something. "Scout," said Atticus. "Nigger lover is just one of those terms that don't mean anything, like snot nose. It's hard to explain. Ignorant, trashy people use it when they think somebody's favoring Negroes over and above themselves. It slipped into usage with some people like ourselves when they want a common, ugly term to label somebody." "You aren't really a nigger lover then, are you?" I asked. "I certainly am," answered Atticus. "I do my best to love everybody. I'm hard put sometimes. Baby, it's never an insult to be called what somebody thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you. So don't let Mrs. DeBose get you down. She has enough troubles of her own." That's just amazing. Listen to his response. "Are you that?" "Yes, I am. Absolutely. I try to love everybody. Everybody." Swoon, Atticus. One afternoon, a month later, Jem was plowing his way through Sir Walter Scott, as Jem called him, and Mrs. DeBose was correcting him at every turn, when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she screamed. Atticus came in. He went to the bed and took Mrs. DeBose's hand. "I was coming from the office and didn't see the children," he said. "I thought they might still be here." Mrs. DeBose smiled at him. For the life of me, I could not figure out how she could bring herself to speak to him when she seemed to hate him so. "Do you know what time it is, Atticus?" she said. "Exactly 14 minutes past 5. The alarm clock is set for 5:30. I want you to know that," Atticus said. It suddenly came to me that each day we had been staying a little longer at Mrs. DeBose's, that the alarm clock went off a few minutes later every day, and that she was well into one of her fits by the time it sounded. Today she had antagonized Jem for nearly 2 hours with no intention of having a fit, and I felt hopelessly trapped. The alarm clock was the signal for our release. If one day it did not ring, what would we do? "I have a feeling that Jem's reading days are numbered," said Atticus. "Only a week longer, I think," she said, "just to make sure." Jem rose, but Atticus put out his hand and Jem was silent. On the way home, Jem said he had to do it for just a month, and a month was up, and it wasn't fair. "One more week, son," said Atticus. "No," said Jem. "Yes," said Atticus. The following week found us back at Mrs. DeBose's. The alarm clock had ceased sounding, but Mrs. DeBose would release us with, "That'll do." So late in the afternoon, Atticus would be home reading the paper when we returned. Although her fits had passed off, she was in every other way her old self. When Sir Walter Scott became involved in lengthy descriptions of boats and castles, Mrs. DeBose would become bored and pick on us. Jeremy Finch, I told you you'd live to regret tearing up my camellias. You regret it now, don't you? Jem would say he certainly did. Thought you could kill my Snow White on the Mountain camellias, did you? Well, Jessie says the top's growing back out. Next time you'll know how to do it right, won't you? You'll pull it up by the roots, won't you? Jem said he certainly would. Don't you mutter at me, boy. You hold up your head and say, yes, ma'am. Don't guess you feel like holding it up, though, with your father what he is. Man, she is ruthless. Jem's chin would come up and he would gaze at Mrs. DeVos with a face devoid of resentment. Through the weeks, he had cultivated an expression of polite and detached interest, which he would present to her in answer to her most blood-curdling inventions. At last the day came when Mrs. DeVos said, "That'll do," one afternoon. She added, "And that is all. Good day to you." It was over. We bounded down the sidewalk on a spree of sheer relief, leaping and howling. That spring was a good one. The days grew longer and gave us more playing time. Jem's mind was occupied mostly with the vital statistics of every college football player in the nation. Every night, Atticus would read to us the sports pages of the newspapers. Alabama might go to the Rose Bowl again this year, judging from its prospects, not one of whose names we could pronounce. Atticus was in the middle of Windy Seaton's column one evening when the telephone rang. He answered it and went to the hat rack in the hall. "I'm going down to Mrs. DeBose's for a while," he said. "I won't be long." But Atticus stayed away until long past my bedtime. When he returned, he was carrying a candy box. Atticus sat down in the living room and put the box on the floor beside his chair. "What did she want?" asked Jem. We had not seen Mrs. DeBose for over a month. She was never on her porch anymore when we passed by. "She's dead, son," said Atticus. "She died a few minutes ago." "Oh," said Jem. "Well, well is right," said Atticus. "She's not suffering any more. She was sick for a long time. Son, didn't you know what her fits were?" Jem shook his head. "Mrs. DeBose was a morphine addict," said Atticus. "She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctor put her on it. She'd have spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary." "Sir?" said Jem. Atticus said, "Just before your escapade, she called me to make her will. Dr. Reynolds told her she only had a few months left. Her business affairs were in perfect order, but she said there was still one thing out of order." "What was that?" Jem asked. Jem was perplexed. "She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. Jem, when you're sick as she was, it's all right to take anything to make it easier, but it wasn't all right for her. She said she meant to break herself of it before she died, and that's what she did." Okay, I'm going to explain this here. Pause. So she was addicted to morphine as a painkiller, but she didn't want to die addicted to anything, beholden to nothing and nobody, attached, dependent on nothing. So that's why the kids would go over there and read to her. He's going to explain this, but it'll make a little more sense if you know ahead of time. Um, she was going through withdrawals, and that's why the clock would go off a little bit later and a little bit later and a little bit later, because as she would get closer to that clock going off, that's when the withdrawals would hit. So that's why she would stop correcting him. That's why she would go into those fits. Then the bell would ring, the kids would leave, and she would get her morphine shot. But she, as you notice, it was by the end, it was well into the evening when they were reading, and Atticus was home. So it got later and later and later. So that's what she was doing. And Jem reading to her was a distraction from that physical pain that she was enduring. There's a spider. Sorry about that. Jem said, "You mean that's what her fits were?" "Yes, that's what they were," said Atticus. "Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt if she heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on that alarm clock. If you hadn't fallen into her hands, I'd have made you go read to her anyway. It may have been some distraction. There was another reason." "Did she die free?" asked Jem. "As the mountain air," said Atticus. "She was conscious to the last, almost. Conscious," he smiled, "and cantankerous." I mean, he's like ornery, obnoxious. "She still disapproved heartily of my doings and said I'd probably spend the rest of my life bailing you out of jail. She had Jesse fix you this box. Atticus reached down and picked up the candy box. He handed it to Jem. Jem opened the box. Inside, surrounded by wads of damp cotton, was a white, waxy, perfect camellia flower. It was a snow on the mountain. Jem's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Oh, hell devil! Oh, hell devil! He screamed, flinging it down. Why can't she leave me alone? In a flash, Atticus was up, standing over him. Jem buried his face in Atticus's shirt front. Shh, he said. I think that was her way of telling you that everything's all right now. Jem, everything is all right. You know, she was a great lady. A lady? Jem raised his head. His face was scarlet red. After all those things she said about you, a lady. She was, Atticus said. She had her own views about things, a lot different from mine, maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is. It's always I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. DeBose won all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I ever knew. My phone's ringing obnoxiously. Jem picked up the candy box and threw it into the fire. He picked up the camellia, and I went off to bed. I saw him fingering the wide petals. Atticus was reading the paper. My phone's going to stop in a second. Okay, so let's talk about this end. So you got the withdrawal part. We got that part. Couple of things to point out on this. Okay, first of all, the flower that comes home. It can be interpreted in two ways. One, it's Mrs. DeBose, as Atticus is saying, everything's all right. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate this. This is good. The second way to interpret it is how Jem did. Like, it's her final dig. You know, he's like, opens this and he's like, oh my God, is she ever going to leave me alone? Is she always going to haunt me? So you can look at it both ways. And it's probably a combination of both. It's probably a little bit of her kind of sick, older lady humor. And at the same time, it is also a thank you. Next part. I love, Jem is like, oh my God, she called you all those horrible names, and you are calling her a lady, a term of respect. And Atticus is like, yeah, like we believe differently, but I want you to see what courage is. And here's this comparison of these chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is the dog chapter, which is an example of physical courage. Atticus protecting the neighborhood from that dog and that danger. Here we have an example of real courage, according to Atticus. It's not shooting the dog. It's not the physical act. Real courage is fighting a battle that you know you're going to lose, but fighting it anyway. He was like, she could have very easily died before she was able to beat this habit, to beat this addiction. And she didn't know that she would get to the end before she died, but she was like, I'm going to do this. And that's an act of moral courage, right? That's real courage. It also is a reference, you know you're beat before you begin, but you begin anyway. Atticus said this was about the case. We're going to lose this case, Atticus said. Are we going to win? He said, no, we were beat 100 years ago. But you have this idea that that's what real courage is this moral fight for what is right for you, what you believe is right, even if it's physically difficult, even if it's frowned on by everybody around you. But real courage is this idea of doing the right thing. This brings us to the end of part one. Kind of the first part I said is like Sandlot, and the second part I said is like that courtroom movie, A Time to Kill. So the second part next time. See ya.